All right, what's going on, everyone? Hope you are all doing well out there, and thanks for tuning in to our first post-KeyShot World webinar. My name is Kareem Merchant, and I'm one of our creative specialists here at Luxion, based out of our Orange County, California headquarters. And today, I'm going to be talking about the material graph. Hopefully, all of you have had the chance to work with the many awesome features in KeyShot 9, but if you have not, you can download a free trial copy of KeyShot at keyshot.com/try. And as always, a recording of this webinar will be available at youtube.com/keyshot3d, where we'll also post a download link to this presentation. The comment section on YouTube is a great place to engage in the KeyShot conversation, and it's also a great place to let us know your thoughts on new features, as well as post comments and suggestions relating to future learning content. And I do want to apologize ahead of time. We're not using our usual mic, so if the audio sounds a little bit off, sorry about that. And so today, I'm going to be giving you guys a general overview of all things material graph. We'll look at some examples of what you can accomplish using it, as well as go deeper into the individual nodes we have at our disposal. Then in the second part of the webinar, I'll demo some of the nodes we talked about and show you how they can be put to use. I'll also introduce you to my top 3 tools to get you started quickly, and at the end, we'll wrap everything up with some Q&A time. I know many of you are usually curious about the desktops we use here. In the studio, we have a tower from Main Gear running an AMD Ryzen Threadripper 2990WX with 32 cores at 3 gigahertz. It has an NVIDIA Titan RTX GPU on board and 128 gigs of RAM running Windows 10 Pro. It's definitely a very powerful piece of machinery. Now, before we start exploring the material graph, we're going to want to know what it is, what it can do for us, and how to quickly get started using it. Some of you may be completely new to the graph, so hopefully this part will help boost your confidence and curiosity on the subject. So, the material graph is a KeyShot Pro feature. It is a node-based visual editor that lets you fine-tune and control materials. And when you open the material graph, it opens in its own separate window. It's essentially a separate workspace that lets you create advanced materials. So anytime you want to customize a material further than what the material properties tab allows, you'll definitely want to work from the material graph. Now, before we get into how to use the graph, let's look at some examples. Typically, real-world objects have slight imperfections that we don't even notice or really even take into account. But it's imperfections like scratches, discolorations, and fingerprints that really sell an image. Here we have a scene of piled rings that's been composed really nicely. The composition, along with the great lighting and depth of field, makes this a really attention-grabbing image. But what really sets the scene off is the patina that's been applied on all the rings. All the scratches, changes in roughness, and other surface imperfections help really increase how convincing the rings appear in context to their imagined environment. This is another wonderfully composed example of how building up layers can drive the realism of your scene. Here, if you look at the wood of the table, it looks like the map is not just controlling the bump height of the surface texture, but it's also controlling the color variation and the roughness as well. And if you look at the gameplay board in the scene, the bumps are being used to create the surface texture, but it also looks like there's a label that's been applied as well to create this debossed print sort of effect on its surface. And finally, if you look to the planchette in the center of the scene, you can see how a bump has been used to create a subtle wood grain texture, and it looks like fingerprints were added to the material as well. Here's another great example with the ground plane of this scene, combining different bumps and roughness to create this really convincing used surface that the watch is sitting on. Another one, this one is one of my favorites. If you play guitar and you've gone a while without changing your strings, then you'll be very familiar with how nasty and patinaed strings can get over time. This image does a great job capturing that with what looks like some adjustments to the roughness. The bridge looks really nice and patinaed as well, and you can see what looks like a fingerprint on the screw that's in focus. That's a really nice touch that really elevates how believable this scene is. Now, the graph doesn't just provide the ability to patina and wear objects, it also gives you the ability to create custom geometry applications like fuzz, flakes, or bubbles, and add displacements. Here you can see an example of bubble geometry being applied to a material on the beer on the left, with the bubbles inside of the liquid actually being driven by a VDB volume map. And on the right, you can see a surface texture that has been created using a displacement map. So now that we've taken a look at some of these awesome examples of what the graph is capable of creating, let's start talking about how to use it. Getting started with the material graph does not need to be an intimidating experience. Obviously, as with many things in life, you can go down the rabbit hole of just about anything, and the graph is no exception. But to get started and immediately see the benefits, you just need to remember 3 things: how to stack bump maps, how to apply and control roughness textures, and understanding how to make the most of the preview color hotkey. If you're new to the material graph and you're looking for a point to build from, then these 3 aspects of the graph are a great starting point. And I'll be doing a demo in the second part of the webinar covering how to use those 3 in your workflows. But first, I want to dive into the material graph and get everyone familiar with navigating the UI. So how do we actually get into the material graph? It's really easy. We can either open the material graph in the project panel and select the material graph button, which I have highlighted here, right here. You'd go into the material tab and that's where you'd find it. Or you can double click the material in the workspace and do the same. Once the material graph button is selected, it'll launch a separate editing window that is the material graph itself. Once you're in the material graph, there's essentially 4 main components that make up the editing window. Across the top, we have the ribbon, which has various tools available that we can use to work with in the material graph. All the way on the right side of the window, we have our material properties. This part of the window only opens when your material is selected. It also looks essentially the same as the material properties tab you're familiar with in the normal KeyShot workspace. And this is where you would go to make adjustments to your nodes. And on the left, we have our node library, which is only visible if you use the hotkey M or select it from the Windows dropdown at the top of the material graph. And this is where you can access your material, texture, animation, and geometry nodes. It also operates like the materials library, where you can drag and drop nodes into the workspace as needed. And finally, that takes us into the workspace itself, which is the empty gray area that is populated by your nodes in the center here. This is where you'd actually build your material. You can also access the different node types by right-clicking on the workspace and selecting the desired node from one of the flyout menus. Something to note here is that whatever material is currently selected will be highlighted in orange. As you can see here, there's an orange outline around that node. This becomes important when you're working with multi-materials or when the material graph becomes extremely populated, because it just helps you kind of navigate and organize a little bit better. So let's talk about nodes. What are they and how do we work with them? Nodes are essentially the building blocks of an advanced material, and each one can be thought of as an attribute of a given material surface. All materials are made up of different colors, textures, roughness, and bumps that lend to their believability, and by using the nodes in the material graph, you can create and control them. So in the material graph, we have 5 types of nodes. You have material, texture, animation, utility, and geometry nodes. If you happen to be working with an earlier version of KeyShot, then you will not have the geometry node, but the other 4 nodes will still be available for you to use. Each of these nodes has these little circular attachment points that represent the various input and output channels for each node. In the image here, you can see that they are located on both sides of the node, with the left side being a node's input channels and the right being its output channel. To get nodes to start working together, you essentially need to connect one node's output to another's input. And by layering and stacking different nodes, that's how you're going to start to build the different attributes that make up an advanced material. So a moment ago, I mentioned that we had 5 nodes at our disposal, 4 if you're using earlier KeyShot versions. So let's take a look at those just a little bit more closely. The KeyShot node library has material nodes, texture nodes, animation nodes, utility nodes, and geometry nodes. They can be accessed 3 ways. You can either right-click the workspace and select them from the node type flyout menus. You can drag and drop them from the material and textures window by hitting the hotkey M or selecting it from the Windows menu at the top of the material graph. You can also use the node menu also at the top of the material graph and make your selection from there. I personally like to use the right-clicking the workspace method for the sake of being as efficient as possible. Let's take a look at these individually and get a better idea of how we can use them. So to get started understanding how material nodes can be used, let's look at how we can create layered materials with them. Essentially, a layered material in KeyShot is similar to a paint job where the base material has had some sort of coating applied over it. If you look at the images on this slide, we have a shot of our material graph. This kind of gives you a look at the anatomy of the material applied to the KeyShot ball right here. At the very front, we have the parent node, which has a material and texture node attached to its surface. So there's the parent node, and here are the attached nodes as well. This was created simply by dragging and dropping a basic textured chrome material from the library. And once I had a base material, I attached a material node to the label input of the parent material. Then I created this kind of wear-through effect by attaching an image texture to the opacity input right here. So I'm actually using the same texture map to drive the bump and the opacity. This essentially uses the texture to mask out certain portions of the material applied to the label input. Something else to note here, when using material nodes, if you're working with illuminated materials, you can use an emissive as a label, but you cannot use a light. So area lights, spotlights, and so on cannot be attached to a parent node's label input. So that was a little on material nodes. I'll get into them a bit more when I get to the demo at the end. Next, let's talk about texture nodes. We have two types of texture nodes available. The first being image textures and the second being procedural textures. Image-based textures are available to everyone from the library panel. You can easily drag and drop them into your material graph and they'll function just like any other node. We also have procedural textures, which are easily added by right-clicking the material graph workspace or by using the node library. Excuse me. Definitely keep texture nodes in mind when you're trying to alter and customize your material appearances. It's going to give you a lot of flexibility. Next up are utility nodes. So utility nodes are completely unique to the material graph, and they're going to be what you want to use when you're trying to combine or alter materials or textures. Essentially, these are going to allow you to control the degree to which a texture or material will affect the parent material that the nodes are connected to. In the newest version of KeyShot, we have 8 different utility nodes available. Some of these are accessible in earlier versions as well by enabling experimental features, but I'll be focusing predominantly on the more commonly used ones. So let's take a look at some of these. The bump add node. So this one is extremely useful, and it falls into my 3 tips for getting started that I brought up at the beginning of the presentation. It's a really simple to understand node. It basically allows you to take 2 or more textures you want to use as a surface bump and combine them into a single output. If you haven't been working with the material graph, you've likely noticed that it's not possible to add more than 1 bump from the materials tab. So if you were curious how to go about creating that effect, you'd need to enter the graph and do so by connecting them to a bump add utility. So here you can see an example of how that would look. I have my first bump texture, which is a cellular texture on the left. I have my scratches texture here in the center, and I've used a bump add node to combine them to create this kind of composite texture that's going on right here. The next one we're going to look at is the color adjust node. Just as the name suggests, the color adjust node allows for the adjustment of the overall color information of a texture map or a procedural. By connecting a texture to a color adjust node, you can control things like hue, saturation, and contrast, and you can also overlay colors and adjust color value as well. So in this case, I have this ceramic texture that's plugged into my color adjust node, and over to the right is what you would see in the material properties when the node is selected. So here's that dull ceramic texture, and here's the color adjust properties. Here's where I would make my adjustments if I wanted to change the hue or give the overall texture a colorized tint. This node comes in particularly handy when you're trying to adjust logos or texture colors on the fly without having to actually go into Photoshop and then come back in to do Here's an example of using the color adjust node with that same ceramic texture. On the left is the original color without any adjustment. In the center, I've used the hue slider to change the overall hue of the texture, and I believe I've added a little saturation as well. And on the right, I've completely desaturated it so it's grayscale. The next one up is our color composite node. So in this case, the color composite node works similarly to the bump add node. The difference here being that they can be used outside of just bump applications, and you get the benefit of being able to combine them through blending modes and by creating transparency masks. This node works similarly to how layer blending modes in Photoshop work. So if you have your first layer here represented by the source input, right there is your source input and your first layer, and your second layer here represented by the background input, and the curvature is functioning as that second layer, you can now start to control how your background layer and that source layer will interact with each other. And whether you're trying to mask elements out or blend them together, the color composite node is what's going to help you do that. So here's an example of how the node setup from the last slide would affect a gloss white material. On the left, we have our base material, which is just a gloss white paint. I've added a curvature texture and an occlusion texture, which you can see in the center. And then using the color composite, I've combined those to create this effect on the right-hand side. Really useful for adding detail into your scenes and adding a little bit of realism. Now we have the color invert node. This one's another really useful node and is really easy to understand. Again, just as the name suggests, this node is used to invert the color of a texture. So if you have a black and white texture driving an effect and you want to flip how it appears, you can use the color invert node to achieve that. Now this happens to be a grayscale texture that I have plugged in over here, but it will also work with colored textures and just output the inverted color information accordingly. The color invert node is definitely another one of those nodes that reduces having to jump back and forth between programs like Photoshop. So definitely keep it in mind when you're trying to speed things up a little bit. The next one we're looking at is the color key mask node. Now, this node I imagine would be extremely useful for packaging designers. It can be a little tricky to use, but it's pretty easy to understand. Essentially, what the color key mask does is it allows you to choose a specific color from your texture and mask it out. And if you look here at this example made by Will Gibbons, you have this label kind of texture going on here. And I want to keep the colors in the center, but I want to mask out the white so that I can see the object behind it. So using the color key mask, that white space has been masked out as black. And then when it's applied to the final image, you can see the image, the actual model that's behind this label texture. And then obviously the labels had some sort of foil-like effect put onto it using a metal and using a bump to create that. But that's how you would go about doing something like that. One of the last utility nodes I want to talk about, but definitely one of my most used ones, is the color to number node. What this node allows you to do is fine-tune how a material effect is driven by adjusting the values of black and white in a texture. To make the most out of this one, you'll need to understand how black to white values work in KeyShot. Essentially, pure black represents an absence of an effect and is given a numerical value of 0, while white represents the entirety of an effect and is given a numerical value of 1. So what you're seeing here with this graph example is a bump texture that has been applied and a gradient from black to white being used to drive a gradual fade of a bump texture. Here you can see what our bump map looks like in the center of the image. Then we have our gradient map, which I fine-tuned using the color to number right here. And that's driving the bump height. And then when both are working together, you get this gradual fade in texture, which can be seen on the final image on the right. This node also works kind of in the same manner when working with your roughness maps. And then I'll demo that in a couple minutes here as well. So for the most part, the nodes we've covered up to this point are going to be your most commonly used utility nodes. And the last two utility nodes, which I'm going to briefly cover, are the color curve randomize node and mapping 2D mode. All right, so if you're working in a recent version of KeyShot, then you'll be able to find either of these next two nodes under the utility nodes flyout. If you're working with an older version and want to use them, then you would need to enable experimental features. First up is the color curve randomize node. This node lets you add color randomness to curve geometry. It also allows you to adjust things like hue, saturation, and value, but be aware that this node only works with curve geometry, which can be imported using the KeyShot plugin for 3ds Max, Cinema 4D, or Maya. If you look here, we have a screen capture from the KeyShot manual, which illustrates how the node could be used. And on the far right, you can get a better idea of what's happening with this node. The effect is definitely exaggerated, but it gives you a clearer picture of what's going on. This is one of those nodes where a little goes a long way. So if you are going to use it, don't get too carried away. Otherwise, you'll end up with this kind of unnatural looking color variation that you see here. Mapping 2D is the last of the utility nodes. This one is essentially a UV mapping layer that allows you to control and synchronize the scale and position information across all textures that are connected to it. Basically, what you're seeing here is a mapping 2D node being used to sync both textures. To make sure they're both affected by the node's mapping, you have to actually set the mapping type for each texture as node. That's really useful because now when I make adjustments from the mapping 2D node, it'll apply to all connected textures, and I can keep the relationship between the two the same at any scale or position. All right, so that's it for utility nodes. We have 2 animation nodes, and then I'll start doing some material graph demos for you guys here. So the first animation node is color fade. This one's pretty easy to use. All you need to do is connect the node to a diffuse, specular, or opacity input, and you'll be able to fade between 2 or more color inputs. This one is particularly useful if you're trying to add some colorway or finish options during part of a larger animation. And when it's connected, it will automatically populate your animation workspace with newly created animation. So in the image on the right, you can see that I have a color fade node selected and attached to the color input of my metal, which is what's going on right here. With it selected, you can see what the properties on the right that you can control look like, right in this area. If you look at the top, there's a color gradient that you can interact with and customize. And this is where you would set up the colors that your animation is going to fade through. And then below that, you can see the animation settings that can be controlled from here. And I'll show you guys how to set that up in a moment as well. And lastly, for our nodes is the curve fade animation. The curve fade lets you transition between numerical values within any custom material and can be connected to the diffuse, specular, or opacity inputs, as well as material inputs like roughness or power. The animation works essentially like a color fade, but affects numerical value instead and is dictated by a controllable animation curve, which can be seen on the image to the right here. Something else to note is that both the color curve fade nodes, both the color and curve fade nodes are material animations, and they can only be found inside the material graph. All right, it's demo time. Let's jump into KeyShot here real quick and start using some of these nodes. All right, so the first thing I'd like to talk about is my quick start guide that I brought up at the very beginning. Essentially, the 3 main things to remember here are color preview, bump add, and color to number to drive roughness. So here you have a scene that's pretty much entirely been built just using those, if I'm not mistaken. You can see the roughness changes in the rock down here. You can see the material is got several textures going on here. And I'm going to actually show you how to do that. But first, let's take a look at the material graph and see what's going on inside of it. So the way things are set up currently, I have my metal texture that's attached to an input, and I'm using a color to number node to drive the roughness. That's how I've kind of come up with how this texture is going to create a rough versus shiny effect on its surface. And then down here, I have that same texture map driving the bump. And you can actually, instead of doing it that way, you can take the output from the existing metal texture, which has already been set up the way you want it, and you can plug that into the bump as well. And then it'll affect it at the exact same scale and settings as your color to number for your roughness. So the three things: color preview, bump add, color to number. If you look at the top of your ribbon here in the material graph workspace, this is where you're going to find your different tools to use, and as well as your preview color. A lot faster way to go about using preview color is to actually just hit the hotkey C. And this really speeds up your workflow because you don't have to wait for images to res up. Let me give you an example here. So if I'm looking at what the scale of this texture is, and I hit C, you can kind of see what that texture is looking like. And it's isolated that over the actual material. So it makes it really easy for me to change my scale and see how that actually affects my surface. And then when I'm done, I just hit C and then it'll go back to my original material. Now I use that one a lot when it comes to color to number, when it comes to scaling, when it comes to bumps, because it just lets me kind of get a better idea of how my node is going to be affecting the parent material. And then if we go over here, color to number, and let me actually show you this real quick. So if I got rid of my color to number node entirely, let me just move that guy out of the way, and I had this guy attached to my color, you can right click, go into your utility nodes and pick your color to number from here, or you can actually right click on that connection point that you want to add your color to number to, hit utilities, and then that's where you could add your color to number as well. So I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick. And then now we have our color to number, and color to number is going to drive our roughness values. Double check that. So that's actually driving our color at the moment. So I want to get that to drive our roughness. So I can go plus, and I'll select the roughness, and now it's connected to my roughness input. And you can actually see on the model, since this is scaled up and it's a fresh color to number, that there's a pretty drastic difference between my scratches and non-scratch surface. Now there's this kind of rough to shiny texture going on here. Maybe res up for a second so you can see it a little bit more clearly. And then basically, again, with color to number, it's going to affect your roughness in this case, and 0 is going to be black while white is 1. So if you look over here in our properties, anything that has a 0, so your input from, that's going to be a black, this is going to be a black, this is going to represent a white, and this is going to represent a white. So if I, again, hit my color preview, I can take a peek at how that color preview is affecting my texture that I've applied. And then I can actually go ahead and start adjusting how much I want it to actually affect my parent node. So as you can see, the output from, which is 0, is affecting my dark colors, and then my output to is affecting my light colors. So you can create a more homogeneous kind of material. And so in this instance, if I were to hit C, you can see that a lot of that roughness has kind of, the change in roughness has kind of dissipated. It's a lot more homogeneous at that point. And then smooth basically adds an S curve to your texture as well. So yeah, that's a really, really convenient way to add a bunch of different textures and roughness and add different elements. And the other thing I was going to talk about is bumps. So this does a great job for creating that kind of scratch to rough surface. If you have materials where like maybe like a marble countertop or like a travertine marble where there are some areas that are shinier than others, that's a great way to go about doing that. But what if I want to add multiple bumps to create like a really kind of more in-depth surface? So again, you can right click on the workspace, you can hit your utilities and choose your bump add node from here, or you can get your nodes from here, utilities, bump add node. But again, for the sake of convenience and speed, I like to right click on the connection point, utilities, and then bump add right there. And so basically what's happening here is you have a node now. Let me see if I can get a better view. So you have a node now that is allowing you to plug in a secondary bump input. So I'm going to go ahead and just open up let's use a noise texture. So if I plug that texture into my bump, again, let's hit C, and you can see the scale. I'm going to dial that scale back a bit. And I'm going to increase my bump height just so it's kind of more apparent. And then now you can kind of see how that bump, I'm going to even dial it back a little bit more. But you can see how that bump's affecting the surface, and you can see the original metal texture that was applied as well. Excuse me. So inside the bump node, if you double click that, you have your ratio, you have your weight 1 and your weight 2. And essentially, ratio speaks for itself. It's the ratio between the two of them. And then weight 1 is going to control how much the first bump is going to affect your surface, and weight 2 is the same for the second bump. So if I were to adjust these, I can, pull one texture out farther than the other one, or make the other one sit back farther than the one that I want to kind of stand out. So that one's really nice to use. You can create really interesting surfaces. You just got to kind of imagine what your surface might look like. And the really cool part about this node is you can kind of stack them infinitely. So although there's only 2 inputs here, I can right click another one of these lines and I can add a bump add node, and then I can plug in another texture. Let's just throw a mesh on there, and then I can throw another one on there as well. And I can just keep stacking these as much as I want to create the kind of surface I like. So just using these different elements, the roughness, controlling roughness with color to number, your bump add, and then getting comfortable using the hotkey for the color preview, you're going to be able to immediately jump up the level of your renders and create significantly more realistic products at the end. Oh, and something I didn't mention as well, if you go into your color to number, you can actually invert how the roughness affects your surface. So if I were to apply this and maybe my surface was supposed to be a gloss, but it ended up being kind of rough and the scratches were glossy, that could work if it's kind of scratching through like a soft touch material, but usually scratches are kind of rougher than the surface it was on. So I would just invert this to 1 and that to 0, and then you would essentially have your inverted material. I adjusted these down here, so you would do it down here instead. But yeah, that's essentially how you go about doing that. All right, so the next thing I would like to talk about are opacity maps. So here's that KeyShot ball I had inside of our presentation. And basically what's happening here is I've used a texture on the opacity of my label to create this kind of scratched away, flaked off paint effect on top of my KeyShot ball. And I'm going to open up the material graph. And I'm sure many of you have realized this. When you're opening up a multi-material or you pull something off the KeyShot cloud that has a multi-material, this graph gets a little crazy. And that's because everything, all the different materials that are making up your project space, if you have a multi-material on there, are going to show up on the same material graph. And like I said earlier, the one that's selected currently has an orange kind of outline that lets you control which one you're doing. So I'm going to actually move this out of the way a little bit just so we can focus on what we're looking at right now. I'll bring that down. So all I did here is initially I pulled a textured chrome material from the material library over here. I dragged and dropped it onto there, and that's what created this metal on the surface and the noise texture that was there. So this little trifecta was just created through a drag and drop. What I've done is I've used a texture map, this chipped metal texture map, and I've applied a diffuse material as a label on top of that chrome, and then I gave that diffuse material this blue color right here. So with this texture map, I'm using that as the bump because you can see that there's kind of height. I wanted to get that feeling that there was actually paint that was chipped away. And then I'm also using that under the opacity. So this is another one of those things that you can control using color to number. But in this case, I'm just leaving the map the way it is. I went in here, I changed the contrast a little bit in the width and the height, and that's how I ended up with this kind of effect going on there. But you can have greater control if you use color to number and start actually messing with the parameters. But essentially, to create an opacity map, all you would do is you take a texture and you drop it into your opacity, and then that's how you would determine the degree to which something is gonna shine through or pull through. Now, another cool effect with opacity maps, let me actually zoom out and then we will zoom in, pull this guy up, and we'll get this guy out of the way. So I'm using the exact same chipped metal texture on this one. So let me back out real quick and switch to worn edges. Okay, so that's what we're talking about right now. I go back to the material graph. You can see now it's selected in orange. I'm using the same base material, same diffuse. The only difference here is that instead of having the chipped metal drive the bump, I'm using the contour texture to drive the opacity. So that this is no longer driving the opacity, but it's still driving the bump, and the contour is now driving the opacity. And basically what I've done here using the contour is I've adjusted my contour angle, my contour width, and I've used that to create this kind of faded edges. So if you're trying to create like maybe a soft touch material where, you know, like a cell phone case that gets a lot of use and the edges wear out, this would be a really good way to go about making that. So you have a lot of things you can do with the opacity. You just got to get a little creative and spend some time exploring what's possible inside there. But that's using the opacity input. So the next one I'm going to talk about is the color adjust node. Again, this one's pretty self-explanatory, pretty simple. I have a kettle here, and I've applied a camouflage texture to it. I actually have, let me delete this. There you go. So I'll apply that directly to my color, and you can see that it's the exact same. And then now if I want to do a color adjust node and I want to change the hue or colorize it and give it a tint, again, same ways as before, right click the workspace, hit the node library from the drop down up here. I'm just going to go ahead and right click that, utilities, and we're going to do color adjust. So with color adjust selected, it is outlined in orange. On the right here, you have the properties, and you have the color, which is currently input as the camouflage, and you have your colorize option. So if I want to colorize it and give it a tint, I can just kind of hit that colorize button, come in here, and then anything that I drop over it is going to give it a tint in the color that I'd like to use. So if you're trying to tint something, that's a way to go about doing it. If I want to change the hue, you just jump over to this hue slider, and like instantaneously you can just jump through a bunch of different hues. It's really nice that you don't have to go into Photoshop to create a new texture to drop this in here. It's also nice because it works with the procedural textures as well. And if you want to desaturate something entirely or highly saturate it, you got that here, values of colors, and then your contrast as well. So this is a really cool node. I like this node because it just lets you do a bunch of little quick material variations. So that's definitely something to consider if you're trying to do colorways or finish options. So that was quick and easy. The next thing I want to talk to you about is creating labels in KeyShot. So let's look at that. Make sure I paused the last one. Yeah, okay. So creating labels in KeyShot. Again, it seems a little intimidating, but it's relatively easy. Let's bring that kind of over here. And we'll open up the material library. So I already have this thing set up. I'll kind of reset it up for you. It seems a little intimidating. It seems like there's a lot going on here, but really not too much. We have our ceramic glaze and our paint attached to the surface. I've used a leather texture to create this kind of ceramic-like roughness on the actual mug. So that's it. That's just driving the bump right there. And then I have a texture map, and I've used this texture map as the color on top of the actual label that I've made. And I've used that to drive my first bump, and I've added a secondary bump onto that label as well, which is what's creating this kind of hammered rough texture on this foil label. And the reason why it looks foil is because my color that I'm using is actually a metal. So I'm going to kind of disconnect these, and let's run through making a label real quick. So in that case, I use the KeyShot logo, and I'm just going to drag and drop that onto there. I'll select Add Label, and then I can, let me clean this up real quick. So here's my label that I just added, and I want to scale that label down. I can do it outside of this, but since this is open, I'm just going to do it right here. So I'm going to scale this label down into something that's usable, and then I'm going to actually move that label just so, you know, it's kind of more centered. Let's see if I can. So yeah, that'll work for now. So I've moved my label. I've attached it as a label to my parent material, which is the ceramic glaze right here. And now I want to make it like a shiny foil. So I'll just go in here to my plastic. I'll change my material type to a metal. And then immediately you kind of have this metal shininess going on. I can adjust the roughness of that metal. I'll give it a little bit of roughness since foil is usually not just perfectly shiny. And then I want this to also drive the bump so I can make it look like it's either debossed or embossed. So I've just taken another from that same output, I've dropped it onto my bump, and that's how I've kind of got this effect. And then now I want to texture it with some kind of, you don't have to texture it. If your goal is to create something that looks like this, then you'd be done at this point. But if I want to texture it like I had before, again, just add a bump add node, go to utilities, bump add node, and now I can pull a texture of any kind that I'd like. Let's use a noise fractal this time. And I'll drop that onto my bump. And then there's a little bit going on here, but again, see to color preview, you can see the scale of that texture. I'm going to bring it down a little bit. I'm going to turn some fall off and the bump height up. And then you hit C, and then that's the end result right there. It's kind of this beat up foil label. So that's essentially how you'd create a label. Again, this one's just set as a metal because I was imagining like a foil texture over it, but you could really change it to anything you'd like, plastic paint, and then it'll adopt those properties and you can adjust them accordingly as well. All right, our last little demo here, we are talking about the color fade animation. So here I just have a little tumbler. This one came off the cloud library. And I'm going to open up my material graph so you can see what's going on here. So the color fade animation is what's going to drive or the color fade node is what's going to drive my animation. Everything else here is essentially the same as what we've been covering. Again, super basic, like my getting started idea. You have your texture. It's using color to number to drive the roughness, and it's also being applied to the bump. That's how you're getting this really nice brushed effect on the actual model. And then all I've done is I've taken the color fade and I've attached it to my color input of my metal that's on the surface of my parent material. So when I do that, it'll automatically populate my animation timeline with that animation that you see here. So this will give you an idea of the preview of what's going on. You know, it'll go through the colors that I've determined. So this comes in really useful if you have an animation where there's a lot going on, there's rotations or exploded views, and you want to show colorways while that's happening. If the goal is to show a stationary product and show some colorways, depending on your setup, it might actually be faster to just quickly render out different colors or finishes as images and then composite them in like an editing program later. But if you're really kind of trying to make it be incorporated into more complex animation, then you would use a color fade animation. So back to the material graph, you can see in my properties here, I have the colors that I've determined to be what I want it to fade through. I have it set without a blend mode, so it's really sharp transitions, but if you'd like it to fade, you can hit blend And then when you actually come in here, you'll see that there's a gradual transition between the colors rather than such a hard event. So let me actually show you that color fade node. Let me unplug that. And let's go to our animations and color fade. So if I plug in this color fade and I open that up, you can see that it's just a regular texture, a regular gradient black to white, nothing special. This lets you control to the degree that that gradient is operating. And here's where you can kind of control like when it happens in context to your animation. You can change these colors, just double click on it, and you can pick anything. You can color pick as well if you see another color that you like, and then it'll assign that color. And then if you want to add more colors, you can hit this guy right here and it'll populate the gradient with another color node. So let's say I want this to go from white to red to black. That one will be white. But you notice that it's not really, it's kind of all over the place. There's nothing like specific occurring at a lot of time. So these little sliders, you can kind of maneuver them and use them to reduce how much fade there is between layers, or how much it kind of bleeds into the next layer by just adjusting these guys right here. So that's how you go about building out your color fade animation. And as I said, it automatically populates your animation timeline down here. You can preview it by sliding through, and that's your color animation. All right, so that's it for our demos. Thank you all for tuning into the webinar. Hopefully you all feel a little bit more confident in the material graph going forward. And at this point, let's go ahead and open it up for Q&A, and I will do my best to answer your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kareem. That was really informative. The one question that came up a few times was whether or not we can share the actual CAD models. I know the cup is in the, so the cup that you see there is in the KeyShot model library. I don't know if you can bring up KeyShot real quick and show folks where the models exist in KeyShot. So for folks that don't know, for KeyShot 9, the KeyShot Cloud added the ability to have downloadable models. So Kareem can show that right now.
Yeah, so down here at the bottom is the Cloud Library button, and when you click on that, it toggles the actual library. Then you'll have materials, environments, textures, and models. So this is where you go to find your actual models. And there's actually quite a few, and we're always adding to it. So if you're trying to experiment with models or populate a scene, this is a great place to come. And there's actually the tumbler I used. The ceramic mug should be down here as well, right there. So a lot of these models are already on here. I can definitely package up some of these scenes and put them there as well.
Yeah, is the coffee grinder something we can share? Do you know?
Yeah, so the coffee grinder is actually from our scenes on our KeyShot website, and it's from an old example animation that Will Gibbons put together. So I just pulled that off there, and I took the actual model and I used it. But we can actually probably put that model up here on the Cloud Library, unless there's something that you want to keep it on there. But yeah, we could definitely think about doing that.
That'd be great. Okay, so we can post it on there. And so someone's asking, was the black plastic modeled as a separate part? I assume that they're referring to that coffee grinder. Yeah, each of those would be separate parts. I believe in that. I think he's asking that sort of that piece right there. Yeah.
Right here. Yeah. If we can go in our scene. Well, there's coffee beans on the ground taking up a lot of space, but here goes the coffee grinder, and you can kind of see all the different components that are building it out. So yes, these are all separate materials, which is why it was used as an animation. It had a lot of components.
Yeah, and we can share that. Someone asking, is the chip metal JPEG a custom-made texture map, or is it stock with KeyShot? The high-level answer is that there are texture maps included, and you can also do custom ones. I don't know in the case of that specific one if that was something that was inside of KeyShot or not.
Yeah, no, I actually just drag and dropped it from over here. Here's the, let me change this to list view real quick, and we'll find it.
That's included in the base install, I believe, correct?
Yeah, I believe so as well. There it is right there. So I'm just using the chip metal.
Great.
That's what I used to create that.
Someone's saying, why is diffuse considered a label and metal is applied as a surface? I mean, each one can be separate nodes in the material graph. I'm not sure I 100% understand that question.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you?
I mean, from my experience, you can make whatever material is applied to the label be whatever material you'd like. You just have to actually change the material type. So you can see that right here. You know, you have all the different material types that you can choose from. And if you're in the material graph as well.
Hello, do we lose you?
No, can you hear me?
Yeah, it just cut it for a second.
Oh yeah.
In the bump ad, how are the ratio and weight controls different?
Okay, so let's look here. Let me open that guy up and we'll take a peek. It does not want to select. All right, so let's go utilities, bump add, and then let's just, oh, I guess that didn't work. Yeah, this is a little difficult here. I don't know what, my computer's being a little weird. I cannot select that. Okay, so you have your bump add node and you have your ratio. Essentially, this is the blending factor. From my understanding, the ratio when I'm swapping them back and forth, let me actually demo that real quick. Just pull this guy off.
Yeah, so each of the weights can be individual numbers, and the ratio is the blend amount between those. So you could have one weight could be twice the weight of another one, and the ratio is still going to blend that, so it would basically mix between like 1 and 0.5.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there a way to do different layers of opacity on the same material?
You know, that's actually something I have not tried. I guess we could try that right now. I don't know. Have you ever had any experience with that, Derek?
I don't know. Another question is there a way to switch materials in a multi-material in an animation? So basically in the animation drive, it's swapping through multi-materials.
So from my understanding, and I've heard this question come up quite a few times, you cannot switch between separate materials. You can only switch between like a color or a finish on one material. The way I've done it before is, like, let's say it's an animation or it's a simple animation. I've rendered out that same animation with each of those materials, and then I've post-processed it in another program. Obviously, that's a lot more time-consuming, but to my knowledge, you cannot, other than in that manner.
What geometry-based data can be accessed to the material graph to drive advanced materials? For example, curvature or view angle through the gradient node.
I'm not sure I understand that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I 100% understand that question. My apologies. You need to, when you make changes to materials, do you need to make or save it as a new material? Was wondering if our changes overwrite their original material. So you can talk a bit about kind of the scene specific versus creating a new material out of a scene.
Like as in like if you're in a multi-material?
Well, yeah, I think the question is sort of like, as you're working through this, right, and you're making changes that to that, you will see that and save that in your scene. How would you then export that out so you can then reuse that sort of those changes that you've made as a new material in the material library?
Oh, yeah, actually, I did this recently. I'm not sure I remember exactly how to do it, but essentially you'd have a material, and then Brooke actually is the one that told me how to do this. You have your material, and then you'd save that material, and that would populate it into the material library over here. So you could actually drag and drop it from there for other objects that you need to use. Now, maybe I can get into that a little bit more in depth if somebody wants to, whoever that was, wants to email me, and I can kind of give them a little breakdown. But yeah, you can actually save a created material, and if you really wanted to, if you wanted to share that material, you can actually upload it to the cloud for other people to use as well.
And then, yeah, so a couple questions about that. Yeah, I mean, essentially, as you're working within KeyShot and kind of building out your materials, you can create your own material library, and then you can share that. So you could essentially, have a custom material library that you work with within your own group as you're kind of exploring and creating this stuff. And then, obviously, as you can kind of bring up real quick the material, the KeyShot Cloud again, real quick. And then so people actually, are all the time creating new materials and then uploading them up into the cloud to view those as well.
Yeah, so here's a bunch of the materials that are available.
Yeah. Texture when applied to a part, it looks more like a repeated pattern. Can we make it randomized and not look like a pattern?
If it's an image texture, no, because it's relying on that image. So basically the scale is going to drive it. Now, if you created an image texture at a large enough scale and you thought about that, or you found something and you thought about that beforehand, you'd be able to do it. But if you're actually using a procedural texture, so like maybe material graph, let's delete some of these guys. So in this case, you have your noise texture. That's a procedural texture. Anything that comes out of here, you can control the degree to which those are randomized. So let's say we put on scratches on here. And then I go into scratches. I can change my scale. I can change the density of those scratches depending on the scale of my object. I can change the size. And you see all these different things. I can even change the levels. So if I want small and large and a greater variety, I can crank up that level and you'll kind of get that variation. So procedurals, yes. Image textures, not in KeyShot. You would have to do that or take that into account outside of it.
And someone was asking, if you wanted, for example, where the current kind of, black plastic is, if that were clear glass and you wanted to basically emboss the KeyShot logo into that, so it looks like it would appear as though it's engraved, how would you do that?
Let's go ahead and try it out and see it. So, I mean, I've never actually tried that, but we're about to find out if you can. So let's go to glass. We'll use like a solid gray. So we have glass applied to it, and then I'll go ahead and I'll go to my textures and I'll grab a label. There's the bump label is the easiest. It's a little bit feathered at the edges, so you can kind of get a gradual fade, and then we're going to add that as the bump. Open up the material graph again. Color preview, I can see that the scale is really off, so we're going to change that. Oh. Change our mapping to cylinder. And every time, depending on the scale of your I'm having some issues here. Let me try putting it on a different thing. Depending on your scale of your object, you're always, for the most part, going to have to do some adjustments, and that color preview helps you do that. Let me actually open up a fresh instance of KeyShot, and we'll see if we can do that on a plane. But essentially, you'd go about doing it the same way as a bump on anything else. Is you'd apply your bump texture to your material, and then you change the bump height to accomplish that same thing. So I'm just going to throw a plane out here. Materials class, solid white. It's a little difficult to see. And then if I were to attach a label, yeah, so there you go. You can see that's how the bump texture is affecting it right there. So that's a glass material, and it looks like it's kind of giving this debossed look on the material surface. So yeah, it's the same way as you go about applying a bump on anything else.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, I think that we are running out of time here, so we're coming up towards the end of the program. I want to thank everyone for attending. Reminder: this is streamed to YouTube, so you can go onto our YouTube page. If you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you'll get notified when new videos are added. We're adding, a number of videos every week, quick tips and webinars once a month. You can also ask questions there or in our forum. So if you have a question that wasn't shown here, one thing that really helps is to provide examples. So if you're sort of saying, hey, I don't know how to do this in KeyShot, if you have a photograph or an image of what you're trying to accomplish, you can definitely post those in the forum and we'll take a look. But yeah, please definitely follow us on YouTube, follow us on Twitter as well, which all of our content goes to, Facebook, and LinkedIn as well. So we're really pushing out all this content out there. And if you actually go to our blog as well, you can kind of follow along. So in the cases like the pattern tool or the new benchmark mode, you can actually download the various models or scenes to follow along with at home. So thank you again for joining us. Any parting thoughts or words for us, Kareem?
Yeah, again, thanks everybody for being here. And if anybody thinks of other questions they'd like to ask, feel free to email me at kareem@luxion.com or connect via LinkedIn. And thanks for sticking with me. Don't forget to stay tuned for upcoming tutorials.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining us today, and we'll see you online.